Good morning. My name's Tessa Peters, and I'm a member of the Ceramics Research Centre UK at the University of Westminster. I'm delighted to welcome the audiences at both the Dr. Bhau Daji Lad Museum in Mumbai and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London to this live link panel discussion From Mumbai to South Kensington, a shared history in clay. It's part of the Global Design Forum of the London Design Festival 2024. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to our esteemed panelists in Mumbai, Tasneem Zakaria Mehta, Director of the Dr. Bhau Daji Lad Museum, and Madhvi Subramaniam, artist and member of the curatorial team of the Indian Ceramics Triennale. Tasneem Zakaria Mehta is editor of the excellent book, Mumbai, A City Through Objects, 101 Stories from the Dr. Bhau Daji Lad Museum. It's highly recommended and available in the V&A shop. Her museum won UNESCO's 2005 Asia Pacific Award for its comprehensive restoration, and under her directorship has pioneered contemporary art exhibitions that serve to challenge the exclusionary politics of the former colonial period. Artist Madhvi Subramaniam lives and works between Mumbai and Singapore. Her works in clay take the form of sculptures and installations, and sometimes involve the participation of the audience. They've been featured in numerous biennales, and public collections that hold examples of her work include Indian Heritage Centre, Singapore, Fuel India Museum, China, and Shigaraki Ceramic Cultural Centre, Japan. She's represented by Gallery Kamuld, Mumbai. In London, our panelists are Alan Graves, Senior Curator, Ceramics and Glass, 1900 to Now, at the V&A. His recently published book, Studio Ceramics, British Studio Pottery, 1900 to Now, is the primary reference for 20th century and contemporary British studio ceramics, as well as a record of the National Collection of British Studio Ceramics held at the V&A. And deservedly, it's been shortlisted for this year's Berger Prize. Phoebe Cummings is an artist and research associate with the Ceramics Research Centre UK. Phoebe's well known for creating temporary installations from raw clay that explore themes of nature and time. Her major installation, I Hear Myself with My Throat, is currently on show at Pallant House, Chichester. Her work is also featured in the exhibition The Laughing Stock of the Heartless Stars, recently opened at the Brown Collection, London, and in Dust to Dust, alongside works by Magdalena Ibakanovic and Robert Mapplethorpe, opening tonight at the Sid Motion Gallery, London. The discussion will be chaired by my colleague Claire Toomey, artist and director of the Ceramics Research Centre. So, the focus of today's discussion concerns the parallel histories of the two museums, their collections of ceramic art and contemporary perspectives. We'll be hearing how the museums work with contemporary artists, as well as the value of working with museums from the perspective of the artist panelists. The seed for today's event was sown over 2 years ago in a meeting between the Ceramics Research Centre and Madhvi and Neha Kujikar of the Indian Ceramics Triennale. We met in London. And it was during that conversation that we learnt that the Dr. Bhau Daji Lad Museum was once known as the Victoria and Albert Museum in Bombay. It opened to the public in 1872. And so it was, in fact, the first V&A, given that the V&A in London was not known as such until 1899. So I give you that as an example of conversation as a catalyst, in that it led the CRC to visit the Dr. Bhau Daji Lab Museum in 2023 and to have further meetings with members of the Indian Ceramics Triennale. That also included artists Anjani Khanna, Shabani Dasgupta, and Rayaz Badruddin. And we've been exploring how we might work together on future projects. The idea of conversation as catalyst is also the theme of the newspaper that you found on your seats here today. And that paper gives a flavor of some of the conversations instigated by the CRC and its partners, who include Linda Sorman of NYU Steinhardt, the Indian Ceramics Triennale, and Sam Naughty of Kwame Nkrumah, University of Science and Technology in Ghana. So these were conversations involving globally distributed artists working with clay and leading curators in the field. The conversations have taken place in a non-hierarchical space where ideas and issues can surface, allowing us to discover shared agendas and learn about alternative perspectives. So, returning to today's theme of the shared histories of the Dr. Bhau Daji Lab Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum in South Kensington, both are significantly connected to the Great Exhibition of 1851 and examples of ceramic art that travelled to London from Bombay for the Great Exhibition can now be found in the collections of the V&A, while Dr. Bhau Daji Lab Museum also retains similar examples. Such shared histories are our starting point, and now let's see where the discussion takes us. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Tessa. In the time that we have for our discussion with our esteemed speakers, director, curator, and artists who have shown great generosity in joining us here, I do want to take a moment to recognize how valuable this moment is to have two audiences. So your role is important to us. You are not merely witness, you are the texture of today's discussion. So audiences in Mumbai, we welcome you, and the same here in London, because every train or bus or journey you've taken to be here, I hope will be worthwhile once we've finished our questions. And to start with, I want to build on from Tessa's wonderful introduction that gives us a real understanding of the gravity and space in which this conversation is occupying. And so I'd like to start institutionally, and I think as we move through the next 40 minutes of discussion, we'll draw in the artists and Alan and all of these decades of experience that have allowed us to rest and gather in this space to understand what is possible in dialogue, the things that Tessa was just talking about. So Tasneem, I shall call on you to begin with and ask you the question that I know you feel passionate about and is illustrated in your book so well. What part has clay played in your museum's founding history?
Thank you, Claire. And I'd like to thank you and the V&A and the London Design Festival and Phoebe for inviting us to share our history and our practice with you. And it is, as you say, quite extraordinary. This is the first time that we are engaged in this sort of cross-continental kind of conversation. And thank you so much for initiating it. You have been the prime mover. Thank you very much. So, as you know, pottery and clay are a very important part of our founding collection. The museum, as you rightly said, is the erstwhile Victoria and Albert Museum. And like the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the entire focus was on design and creating artwares that would be commercially viable in the international markets. There was no tradition of pottery, I have to say, in Bombay of that time. There was a community of potters, of kumhars, as we call them, in Dharavi, which is now one of the largest slums of Asia, but it has still that potter community there. And that community of potters had migrated from Gujarat, but they were potters who made pots like every village potter for the daily needs of the Indian villages. And the idea of pottery, and traditionally, has been that it's something that is useful, functional, very beautifully created, but it is impermanent. You can discard it. And so the idea of creating pottery that was different in form, the designs were Indian, but the forms were very Europeanized, were different in form, and that would be marketable, therefore had to be very stable, was really quite an alien idea. And the person, the genius behind this whole endeavor, this really extraordinary endeavor of what is called Bombay School pottery or Wonderland art pottery, of which I know the V&A has a very large collection, and there are collections across the world at the LA County Museum in Australia, in other parts of India. This was an experiment. And it was an extraordinary experiment because it was pushing against amazing, unbelievable odds. And the odds were that there was no clay in Mumbai or Bombay of that time that was stable. The potters didn't understand how to do these very exotic forms. They had never glazed, which was very important. And so how did you teach them? So the School of Art, with which the museum, like South Kensington, was closely allied, and George Terry, who initiated this project, was curator of the museum. He was also the superintendent of the School of Art. George Terry was determined to do it. So in Sindh, in Multan, there was a tradition of pottery, of glazed pottery that comes from Persia. So Terry decided that he was going to import the potters from Sindh. Very simple. You can import potters from Sindh to Mumbai, to Bombay, and he will wave his magic wand and make this beautiful pottery happen. Well, it wasn't so simple because the potters in Sindh refused to come. And then after many, many inducements, one potter called Nur Muhammad came. And part of the reason they didn't want to come, as you can imagine, they were Muslims. The potters here were Hindus. That was a different language. And finally, when this potter came, he refused to divulge his glazing secrets. He said, he locked himself up in his room and he refused, even though all the British superintendent and Terry and John Griffiths and John Kipling and John Lockwood Kipling, who was there, they all tried to persuade him, but he would not be persuaded. And so in the end, he was doing the glazing. The potters were taught how to produce these extraordinary forms, which are very much European in form. And the designs were taken from Ajanta because Griffiths had sent his students to Ajanta, these very famous caves close to Mumbai, which are 2nd century BC, which have extraordinary paintings on them. And they considered them to be the epitome of Indian design. And so these designs were then transferred onto the pots. And between Terry and John Lockwood Kipling and John Griffiths, they designed the pots which were executed by the Gujarati potters and glazed by the Muslim potter from Sindh. So it's an extraordinary story of completely different communities coming together to produce this beautiful, absolutely extraordinary pottery that was sold out at all the international exhibitions and at Liberties in London. And so that's the story of our engagement with clay and with pottery in the beginning of our history.
Tasneem, I'm not allowed to do this, but I'm doing it anyway. I've got a second question before I move to Alan, which is, after visiting Dharavi last year, which was such a huge honour to be invited into that space, so thank you, Madhvi. Because traditions arrive very quickly and they become traditions and they become the next step in a handmade history. Do you think the potters of Dharavi, their glazing, the firing, do they live with this knowledge, this importing, the skills being imported? Has that dissolved to now this is the tradition of Mumbai?
Well, yes, Bombay pottery actually didn't sustain because it was very much Terry's project, and it was for about 20 years. And then very sadly, that beautiful pottery didn't continue. And when he left, it sort of, the workshop was dismantled. But I think what we as a museum are trying to do is exactly keep up with that kind of spirit of innovation, of experimentation, of bringing so many different communities together to find what we share and how we can together create a practice that is meaningful.
Well, I'm looking forward to coming back to that specific area in a moment. But first of all, I'll move back to Alan to ask you about the role of clay in the founding of the museum here in South Kensington.
Okay, well, thank you, Claire, and thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be part of this conversation. Yeah, if I can rewind a little bit and just kind of explain something about the kind of history of this museum, the kind of complicated history of the V&A. It kind of really goes back to the 1830s and discussions about the quality of manufacturing and kind of government moves essentially to try and improve the quality of manufacturers. And that led to thinking along two lines. One was art education, and the other was the importance of formation of collections of art as exemplars. And it was really the first of those things that kind of took shape. So our history, similarly, is kind of very much based around kind of schools of design. So there was a school of design founded in 1837 at Somerset House, and then 1852 that moved to Marlborough House, and by that point the Great Exhibition had happened and collections were beginning to be formed. And there was formed then in 1852 a kind of museum of manufacturers, so-called, quickly changed its name. Our history is riddled with name changes, but it quickly changed its name to the Museum of Ornamental Art. And that was at Marlborough House on the Mall in the 1850s. But the other great thing that the Great Exhibition did, as well as kind of provided some kind of seeds of collecting, was to actually kind of produce a kind of injection of cash. And that allowed the purchase of land at South Kensington, and that the beginnings of this site kind of were developed during the 1850s. So the Museum of Ornamental Art moved to this site in South Kensington in 1857, but it was at that point still in rather kind of temporary buildings, basically. And this extraordinary kind of building program kind of begins at that point. And it's really kind of continued, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. But so you have this kind of extraordinary building beginning in the late 1850s. And really the kind of grandest part, the most important part of this site was developed here around the lecture theatre, what we kind of think of as the lecture theatre block. So if you stand in the museum's garden and you look towards look north, and you see this magnificent facade, this was built in the 1860s, and this was the original entrance to the museum. That's why it's such a grand kind of facade. So this was designed by Francis Falk, and has this extraordinary decoration on it that was the work of Godfrey Sykes. And so to go back to clay is really, and ceramics are absolutely at the heart of this institution and at the heart of this program of building. So if you look at the facade, from the garden. You'll see this extraordinary terracotta that's the columns, the pediments, which is designed by Godfrey Sykes, and it's absolutely remarkable. And then you come into the building, and the building was absolutely overlaid with this extraordinarily rich ceramic decoration that became kind of known as the South Kensington style. And this was the work of Frank Moody and Godfrey Sykes and others. And you see it still in elements of the decoration of the galleries that lie at the foot of the steps up to the lecture theatre. You see it particularly in what we call the ceramic staircase, what's the west staircase, which has this extraordinarily rich kind of majolica type Renaissance-inspired decoration produced by Minton, and you see it to great excess in the original refreshment room designed by James Gamble that's directly underneath us. This was extraordinarily expensive decoration, and the kind of money began to run out. I think Henry Cole, who was the museum's first director, envisaged the entire museum being clad in ceramics in this kind of way, but the money kind of ran out. But it's an extraordinarily rich, opulent kind of decorative style. And so ceramics is absolutely kind of ingrained in the building, as it were, but it's also kind of a fundamentally important part of the museum's collection from the outset. So again, if you when you leave the lecture theatre and you walk down the steps, you'll find yourself in what's now the Silver Gallery, but that was the original ceramics gallery of the museum that kind of opened around about 1870. And if you look around the frieze of that gallery, you'll actually see a whole series of names of places around the world, and these are names of ceramic production centers, so they're nothing to do with silver and ceramic production centers. So the ceramics collection, as it was being formed, was kind of center stage in the museum, right in this kind of grandest part of the museum. So it was a hugely important and central element to the museum's activities. And indeed, when the museum did then extend further in 1909, in fact, the building work began in around about 1899, which is the moment when the museum, in honouring Queen Victoria, changed its name to the Victoria and Albert Museum. She actually wanted it just to be the Albert Museum, but she was encouraged for it to be the Victoria and Albert Museum. So 1899 was when the museum became the V&A. But that marked the start of this huge additional building program, and that's all of the buildings along Cromwell Road. And at that stage, the ceramic collections, which were enormous by that point, moved to the entire top floor of that new building. But they started here in this glorious lecture theatre block.
And I've never seen that frieze downstairs, which is so shocking. But it really connects with what we're discussing in some form today that we'll touch on as we move through the discussion, is clay being a superconnector running through every museum globally, and from that running through people's hands. It's a very live material. It's always advancing because of the way it's made in a contemporary moment. And so I'm going to go and look at the frieze downstairs, because now we've got a list of the manufacturers at that time. It's very exciting. But Alan, if it's okay, I'm going to stay with you for a moment, because in the discussion so far, we've looked back, taking us forward, and you are a pioneer of this area for the ceramics, and we will move over to Tasneem and Madhvi in a moment to talk about the contemporary work that's happening there in the museum. But I'd love to start with you talking about how you, in the museum, work with contemporary artists, and the work you have done over the last 2 decades has changed the direction for ceramics and its trajectory, without doubt.
Well, thank you, Claire. I mean, it's been, an extraordinary kind of privilege to have been engaged with the museum and engaged with contemporary ceramic practice throughout my career at the museum. I mean, one of the extraordinary things really about the museum is that the contemporary has always been absolutely at the heart of what we do, really. The museum has acquired contemporary work throughout its history, particularly through the auspices of the former circulation department, but also other departments too, and also through the kind of commissions of architectural elements of the building, as I'd mentioned. So it's a kind of fascinating push and pull, I think, in the museum between the contemporary and the historic. And anything that goes on here is kind of set against this kind of history as well, which gives it an interesting flavor. But certainly I've wanted to be, as engaged as possible and had the opportunity to be with contemporary ceramic practice. And there's an interesting kind of duality, I suppose, in being a curator, in that you're trying to reflect what's happening in practice outside the museum, but you have to recognize that you are a kind of driver of that practice too, whether you like it or not. And I think we do like it, and so having that kind of engagement with practice and seeing where it's going has always been, a kind of extraordinarily wonderful opportunity. And I think, in my own career, and I think perhaps the kind of work that Claire is perhaps alluding to, is the fact that I think by the turn of this century, by around 2000, it became quite evident that the type of collecting that we had traditionally done and the type of engagement that we had perhaps traditionally had with ceramic artists wasn't quite fit for purpose in terms of the way that artists were working. And so I think we wanted to become much more engaged with the action, I suppose you might say. And that also kind of sits very comfortably, I think, with the kind of educational imperatives that the museum had, the museum's desire to be kind of really engaged with the ideas around making, and these are really kind of playing out big time at V&A East, as I think we'll all see in the next couple of years. But one of the big steps was actually to kind of start thinking about having people working and making ceramics in the building. And so when we had the opportunity to redevelop the ceramics galleries, which we did in 2009, 2010, we created spaces for ceramic artists to come in and work in the museum, and we began a residencies program for ceramics. And that's really been a kind of transformative thing, I think, to have people, well, you've both indeed a kind of alumni of this program. And that's an extraordinary thing. And I think also we've, through other programs, contemporary programs and the Friday Lates program, and other ad hoc activities, we've really tried to bring ceramics in different ways into the museum and kind of change the way people maybe think about ceramics. So presenting work as kind of, temporary installations and quite ephemeral installations, and producing work that might be sold in the museum or might disintegrate in the museum or might do other kind of surprising things. And so, yeah, I'm beginning to kind of like ramble slightly here, but it's really about trying to kind of represent this, these new ways of working in the most extraordinary ways. And we'll have to say, we have the most extraordinary ceramic resident, Jackie Ramricker, who's in the audience today, and please do go and see her and her work in the galleries after this, because it's a wonderful program that continues.
And it was lovely hearing you talk about some of the aspects of the temporary, which goes straight back to Tasmin's introduction of talking about how we believe that clay is a permanent thing, but actually the instability of it was part of the tradition over in Mumbai. But before I come back to you, Tasneem and Madhvi, I'd like to draw Phoebe into this moment, because you have been artist in residency. You've made really significant pieces of work here. And so the context of the museum as an artist working within that, could you tell us about that, Phoebe?
Yeah, and I think, the residency program in particular really felt like, it was a way for practices like mine that don't necessarily result in an object that fits into that typical system of collecting, but that they could be still active within the museum and still be in very much direct dialogue with the objects. And, for me, there's so many projects that I've done since the residency that kind of link back to historic objects in the collection here and the kind of thoughts that they triggered. And yeah, I guess as a contemporary artist, you kind of, part of your role in the museum as well is kind of opening up these connections for other people to the historic. And often I think with some of those objects, there might be things we overlook, or maybe at times, you know, with different decorative kind of fashions, and you know, it can be difficult for people to maybe connect with them or like find a way in sometimes. And so I think that as an artist, there's kind of this point where you can kind of maybe shift how visitors to the museum kind of look or relate, or yeah, kind of rethink the collections in some ways as well.
And you can only answer this within the means that you have. You use clay, and so coming to a place that has, I mean, you know, the Palace of Ceramics, as Alan has called it, how does that affect your practice, so working within that rich history that is surrounded here?
Yeah, and I think, you know, for me, I guess the overwhelming thing was just to be in this space that's kind of so dedicated to preservation in a way, but to be kind of continuing to work in this other way, which really isn't, I guess. But, you know, I think that kind of, for me, created really interesting tension, both in terms of developing my own thinking, but hopefully also for people that were kind of coming into the space and kind of witnessing that. And yeah.
And I think it'd be great, Madhvi, if we could draw upon your experience, and thanks for your patience. We're moving back over to Mumbai now, so thank you. But Madhvi, your work is hugely expansive, and of course your responsibility with the Indian Ceramics Triennial gives you a wealth of knowledge. But I think I'm asking you to speak from your personal experience, maybe, of, as an artist who works predominantly with clay, how have museums been a part of your contemporary practice?
Thanks, Claire. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah. So I've had the opportunity of not only showing in museums but also interacting with the museum collection, just like Phoebe talked about being inspired by an object, or allowing an object really to come into the main, bringing more attention towards an object. So I worked in a museum in Singapore in the Indian Heritage Center, and I actually picked up a small object that was kind of ignored, almost forgotten. It's a little tiny ceramic cup that was used for collecting rubber from the rubber plantations. And, objects have the ability to tell stories, and objects have histories embedded in them. They have the ability to tell you so much more. They speak. So I actually didn't know what I was getting into when I picked that object and said, I'd like to think about how to work with this small little object that was kind of forgotten. And through that, through working towards it, I kind of uncovered for myself the whole history of the colonial uh, past of Singapore, and the rubber plantations, how actually the seeds came. And there's a story in there, and how the rubber seeds was stolen from Brazil by the British and brought to Kew Gardens. From there, they went to Calcutta, which they didn't germinate there. Eventually came to Singapore, and then entire Singapore was decimated to produce rubber, and there was this little ceramic cup that stood out to tell a story about that whole history. So it was really fascinating for me to learn about that object, and the object told me so many stories. And when I did this entire installation of about 1,008 cups, that were my version of that cup, with the images of it was called Ode to the Unknown. So they had images of the laborers embedded in the installation. So it was really highlighting or talking about labor politics, on how, it was this conversation. The cup became a conversational piece between two communities, the Chinese and the Indians, who actually worked on the rubber plantation. And this little cup was there to tell a story. So, yeah, I totally enjoyed that kind of intervention. And of course, we've done exhibitions in museums and all that. So, yeah, that's always fabulous to get an opportunity. It's not every day that we get opportunities like that. So,
And I think that I'd like to press you a little further and pick up on something that Phoebe kind of illuminated us with, because often as artists, I can say this with confidence, we're single-minded, we're thinking about the artwork. And of course, what Phoebe has, wisely illuminated for us, of course, you come to a place of clay and you see clay in a new form. So there's a negotiation happening there. Can you tell me about some of the response within a museum setting of your contemporary work?
is that directed to me?
It is, Madhvi.
So I think there's been, like, for example, several of our Indian Ceramic Triennale members, we worked towards building an Indian Ceramic Museum in Fuping in China. And several of us were there. And it was, so it's the opportunity of building a collection in a museum or for a museum is different from intervention in a museum's collection. And very often, as artists, you also you become a curator. It's part of your practice to go into the museum collection, change the collection, perhaps reorganize it, and represent it in a completely different way. So Bhauraji Lat Museum has a fabulous collection, and we are waiting to get into that collection.
Well, that's a very nice introduction to talking to Tasneem. And Tasneem, I have only seen photographs of the groundbreaking work you have done with contemporary artists in your museum. And I would very, very much like for you to tell us, I know as an artist that must have been a very, very difficult process, but one that is much needed. I wonder whether you could tell us about the contemporary artist interventions that you've undertaken.
So when we did the restoration, as you mentioned, and we won the UNESCO award, the Asia Pacific Award of Excellence, which is the highest award for cultural conservation, what we inherited was a colonial 19th century museum, very beautiful, extraordinary objects, a jewel box museum. But it was, how do you interrogate the collection? How do you make it relevant to the community today? And of course, my own great interest in contemporary art. I studied myself at the Daji School of Art. So this was a very tentative thing that I started in the beginning. I wasn't sure how it would go. I had to persuade the trustees. I had to see how the community would respond. But we had this amazing artist, Sudarshan Shetty, who was our first artist, and he did this extraordinary installation that sort of mocked the statue of Albert that was that is in the center, that it is the centerpiece of our atrium, our entrance atrium. And he did it in a very playful, in a very sort of, mocking himself as well as mocking the history and mocking the idea of power, the idea of making collections, the idea of the museum as well, sort of deconstructing, in a sense, this authority, this idea of being very important. And that was absolutely an incredible success. And we haven't looked back since then. And we've invited almost every significant contemporary artist. We've done 85 exhibitions since we started. Not all of them are solo exhibitions, We have two spaces. We have our main space, and then we have an ancillary space called Special Project Space. But it's wonderful that there has been such a response. The idea was also to take this history, which is a very troubled history, where there were certain intentions, and question those intentions, but also that you see that some of those practices and those intentions, those prejudices and biases continue and exist today in different forms. So, addressing them historically gives us a handle to be able to address it even, even as it happens today. I mean, if we were to address it directly today, it would become confrontational. So when you come to the problem in this sort of elliptical kind of way, you can do it in a much more civilized way, I would say.
And it's interesting to think about the the negotiation that the artist practice can bring to a site that, as you say, can broaden very difficult and complex questions that sit within the objects or the museum or their histories, and the role of the artist. And we can say the role of the artist, but I know from both Tasneem and Alan's efforts, the artist is foregrounded, but behind that is a brave institute, an institute who is willing to have these discussions where the future is important and the past is kind of a relevant part of that. I think that in the time that we have before audience, this is for you, before we move to audience questions, I'd really like to put the artists first really on the spot with a really difficult question. And you may not have the answers, but we're thinking forward. Today we've been talking a great deal about the histories. We've just heard from Tasneem about the real importance of artists to be active within museums. And so from both of your positions, Madhvi from the ICT and the broad amount of knowledge you have, and Phoebe from your practice that is across many different areas, and of course the work you do at the Ceramics Research Centre, I'm asking you both about the future of ceramics and what you might have a hunch that's coming. Sorry I asked that question. We'll start with, I'm going to start with Phoebe, Madhvi, because that's too cruel to send over to you to start with.
Thanks so much, Claire. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we're in an interesting moment, and ceramics continues to be hugely popular in very different ways. And, it feels like certainly in the past 20 years I've been working, it's kind of, even in that time, it feels like there's been a shift to really include all different kind of forms of practice and engagement with clay that may or may not result in an object. And I kind of think that's something that will continue to grow. And I think in relation to museums as well, that I think there's a recognition by the institutions of the kind of need to be an active place in all different ways, but kind of, and certainly my involvement in museums is kind of grows out of that commitment to be, kind of constantly challenging and not just a repository. And I think also beginning to think, I mean, things that we have talked a lot about, but kind of also breaking down some of those historic structures within the museum, such as departments, and, is ceramics a useful category to define within a museum collection, or, how does that encompass things which are ephemeral, and all those kind of questions that I think, feel like a kind of all at play, and there's still lots of room for things to change and progress. But I kind of think we're questioning things, and
And it's very interesting because what I hear there is that clay is willing to evolve. You know, we've heard that again and again today, and I'm hearing that from you, that it's a very optimistic place, and clay, in whatever form, is willing. It represents what's happening in other areas outside of the museum, and clay still has the ability to represent a contemporary mode of being, whether arts or life. So Madhvi, I've stalled for long enough. Over to you. Sorry.
Thank you. No, thank you. So obviously, I'm going to talk about the Indian Ceramic Triennale as the place of future. As we, we look back at 2016 is when few of us started this conversation on. It came from frustration in a way, because we are all working artists and we all felt like we weren't, our material was not being taken seriously, and there's so much versatility and possibility and ability of this material that it wasn't being recognized. And so we, as artists, we thought we would put together something that really spoke about this, and that's how the Triennale came into being. And if you see we've had, so it's been almost close to 10 years, and we've had 2 Triennales. And if you see the first Triennale and the second Triennale, you'll see that it's different from, it talks about ceramic and its extreme versatility. It does not present ceramic as only an object or an object of, we straddled all various aspects of clay. We wanted to push the boundaries. We wanted to shake things up. And I think we are doing that, and it's bringing more and more people into clay. There's been, we've been told people are very inspired, and they're coming into ceramics, not just from ceramic artists, but artists who are working in other mediums and materials want to now work in clay. So it's quite exciting to see this dialogue happening around this medium and this material. And we want to be medium specific. We want to have clay at the center of it all.
Yeah, and it seems to be that clay has the ability for a broad amount of people to gather around it, to find their place within the medium. And it goes back to clay being a super connector. So whether you're from one practice or another, the clay, we know, is not a friend to many, and it challenges us, and we must learn with this material. So the experience that we can gather around this is, you spoke so well about, Madhvi. Now, Tasneem, I believe at this point we have the opportunity to ask a question from your live audience over in Mumbai.
Tell us something about your experience at the Daji School of Art connection. Tell us about the connection with the Daji School of Art. So is this about my personal connection, or the connection well, I would, it's not about personal, but really I think what's very important is that the School of Art, the Daji School of Art, is a very important institution in Mumbai. It's also where I studied, but it had a umbilical relationship with the museum. As I said, the curators of the school, of the museum, and the superintendent of the school were the same person. And many of the objects in our collection were made by master craftsmen. There were master craftsmen who were teaching the students. And these objects came into the museum collection through the curators. So there is this very strong link. And most of the objects were decorative objects. There was not a tradition of collecting painting, because at the time, Indian painting was not understood, it was not regarded, and therefore it was still almost just prior to independence that painting came into the collection. But if we come back to clay, we have a proposal from Madhvi and Anjani for an exhibition that will be engaging with our collection, and I hope that that is going to be something that we're going to, that's going to be very exciting. Yeah, sorry to sort of take the question in a little different direction, but
Thank you, Tasneem. And we're all very excited with the news that collaboration will be on the brink. What we'll do now is we'll take a question from London. So I'm asking for hands up. There is a mic that will be put towards you when you are ready. We've stunned everyone. We have a question. Thank you.
Hello. I'm not sure if you can hear me. You guys can.
We can hear you.
Good stuff. I wanted to ask about the clay and the deterioration. You said something quickly at the beginning in terms of Indian local clays and not being good in some way. What did I miss? What's something about sort of the clay and permanence, and it wasn't firing right? I guess I'm interested in local geography and your mud as opposed to our mud, as it were.
Tasneem, that question was for you.
So you're talking about the early history. Yes, Bombay did not have clay, the kind of clay that was stable, that could be fashioned into decorative pots. There was no decorative pottery tradition. And so Terry experimented, the workshop experimented with clays, experimented with degrees of firing. And then at the end of it, they brought clay from Gujarat, they brought clay from the south of Bombay, and and some local clay. And there was proportions of this, which was then combined and to produce a clay which would not, as they said, ooze. The word was ooze. And there's a delightful story that John Lockwood Kipling says in his book, that he gifted this pot in one of the early Bombay pottery pots to someone, and they put flowers in it, and the water and the pot leaked, and he was very embarrassed. So when I say that the clay was not stable, it was not stable to be a decorative object in that sense and hold water,
Thank you so much, Tasneem. And I think that we have another question from your audience there in Mumbai.
There's a very nice one which says, which is addressed to the artists and perhaps to you as well, Claire. There is a theory that says clay has memory. What do you think about that? I think every object really has memory, but would anybody like to respond? Alan?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm an artist, but well, yes, I think. I mean, technically, there's this idea that it kind of retakes its former form. During the firing, it'll kind of move back. But I think in terms of memory and objects, then I suppose I perhaps think about it more from a historical kind of angle. And I think objects, traditionally art museums kind of see art objects as kind of being made and having this kind of final moment when they leave the artist's hand, and that's it, as if they were kind of unchanging. But I think objects travel through the world in extraordinarily interesting ways and take on different meanings and different as they move into different contexts. And this happens both in the outside world, but also in museum collections as well. So I think that I love the idea that the objects kind of have these kind of embedded stories. I think when I'm collecting objects, I'm always much more drawn to an object where I understand something of its story rather than its story is completely blank. If you have an object that has been in a specific exhibition, has belonged to a specific person, has been used in a particular way, it enriches it in all sorts of ways. And ceramics, of all materials, it's what forms, our kind of record of human history. It's absolutely embedded in the archaeological record. So, there are these extraordinary memories, in objects, whether we kind of quite understand them or not.
And I love the way that you've talked on a massive scale there, but it happens in our kitchen cupboards as well, which is the wonderful thing about clay.
Absolutely.
Tasneem, if it's okay, can we throw that question over to the artists now as well? It would be lovely to hear maybe first from Madhvi about the idea of the handling and the trace of the maker. I've probably said that badly.
So anybody who's worked with clay knows that clay has memory as a material. You can leave a slab and twist it, and then you put it back in another shape, and then you come back, and as it dries, it takes the shape it had. So it has innate. It's alive, first of all, and it has the ability to hold on to this memory of what it was, what it had formed. So that in itself is beautiful, and it has an ability to speak. As you said, Claire, there's this conversation that clay has the ability to have with us as makers, and this memory that the material in itself has. And beyond that is everything else, as Alan talked about, and more.
And maybe Phoebe, you have specialist knowledge on this.
Yeah, and I could do with about an hour maybe to talk about memory. But I think two things. I guess often in a personal way, I'm dealing with often what I make exists longer term only as a memory. And of course, all objects are loaded with kind of memories. But there's also, for me, in contrast to that, the other side of whilst clay remembers in terms of, it might resort to an earlier shape in firing, but I think for me, I love the erasure of clay, that as raw material, you can dissolve it back to this raw state that actually it kind of forgets. And it's like, I meet it with the same openness that it's like, okay, what we're going to do this time? There's the kind of, in that state, I think you kind of can always go back to zero, which I love, yeah.
And I wonder whether in London, if you don't get your hands up quick, I'm going straight back to Mumbai, all right? Oh, we've got questions. We have one here at the front.
I'm just wondering why clay in particular is a super connector. Why not glass? Why not stone? Why not bronze?
I'm going to direct that to Alan Graves to start with.
Well, I think clay has a kind of pervasive aspect as a raw material. It's kind of it's so widely distributed in the world, and it's so accessible. And it's I think one of the beauties of clay and ceramics, as compared to, for example, silver or gold or whatever, is that it has kind of almost no value or very little value as a raw material. So as a kind of artistic, as an art form, it's all about what the artist brings to it. It's all about what somebody does to it. That's what gives it its value. And so I think that is one of the things that's absolutely extraordinary about it. And I think it's its pervasiveness. It exists in all of these different contexts. You think about ceramics, and it exists in the most basic building materials. It exists in the kind of objects we eat off, and it exists in these extraordinary art objects as well. It's a kind of continuum, and so everything is connected. And I love that about it. I love actually the neutrality of ceramics as a term, and as a curator, I very much welcome the fact that I am a curator of ceramics. I'm not a curator of decorative art or fine art or design or whatever. I'm a curator of ceramics, so that can be all of these things, and at the same time and more. So I think that's why, I mean, it's Claire's term, the superconnector, but I completely get where she's coming from. I think where you're coming from with that term, because it has this pervasiveness. Well, I think it just does not exist in quite the same kind of breadth, but I do take your point that you can kind of, look at other materials from that same perspective. And I would say glass is an extraordinary kind of material and a connector as well. But I think it kind of it's just that little bit less pervasive as a material, and kind of in terms of almost every culture that has existed has made ceramics, as long as they can dig it from the ground, apart from where the ground is utterly frozen. So, it truly is a pervasive global material.
And with that, I'm going to hand over to Tasneem. We are woefully short of time, but it would be wonderful to hear your thoughts, Tasneem. We've run out of time for more questions, but it would be lovely to hear your thoughts on how the clay as a superconnector, you understand that within the terms of your museum.
I think it's very much what Alan said. If you look at our Mohenjo-daro Harappa pottery, it's just extraordinary. When you look at that, and so if you look at all the ancient civilizations, what is it the archaeologists look for first? They look for the evidence is pottery. And I think that comes through the ages, the idea that the village potter, every village in India had a potter. And he carried his wheel on his back, and he would go to all the local hamlets and make pots as they needed. So I think in that sense, that itself speaks that, every village had a potter, that pottery was such an intrinsic part of your daily life. And in many communities, the deities were also made of ceramics, of terracotta, of clay. So it's so this is a tradition that's very pervasive in India, and it is, if you look at it historically, it is a part of our lives. And one of the things that we have to do, I think, is to bring back that connectedness with clay, with pottery. It's a kind of representation of the earth, when you hold a pot of clay, a pot in your hand that's handmade, there's something about connecting you with something very, very primal, in a sense. So I think that is a beautiful thing. That's just my personal feeling about it. Yeah.
Tasneem, because the time is upon us, I'd like you to thank you for closing this discussion so beautifully and in such a meaningful way, because your words connect to probably both audiences in the deepest way possible of why clay has made us all turn up to these two different spaces in different parts of the world. So it's a sad job now joyous job, but sad because we've run out of time. But I'd very much like to thank Tasneem and Madhvi, Alan and Phoebe, for being so generous to talk so openly and with such wisdom to lead us in this conversation today. So huge thanks to you. I also have a massive thanks to your technical team over there for making this possible, and also the technical team here, the London Design Festival and the Global Design Forum for being able to let us all join in this way. I hope that it's been productive for everyone here, and you've all got the newspapers in Mumbai and in London, so you will be able to have further reading, I'm glad to say. So a wonderful thank you to everyone, and I hope that we will meet and continue to talk soon. Thank you.